13 James's psychology. Peirce and William James were lifelong friends, but Peirce believed that James's pragmatism was flawed by a simplistic empiricism. The basis of this difference between them lay in Peirce's semiotic and was made clear in his review of James's famous book The Principles of Psychology, 1890. James argued that perception was a fundamentally empirical, or experiential, process. Consciousness, therefore, was just what it seemed to be according to James, the perception of a continuous stream of thought. James therefore attacked as unempirical and unscientific both the Lockean description of thinking as a process of associating atomistic ideas and also later descriptions of perception as a process of unconscious inference. These arguments were fundamentally antagonistic to the view that Peirce had held ever since his 1868 essay Questions Concerning Certain Faculties Claimed for Man, where he argued that knowledge of the meaning of our thoughts is as indirect and mediated as our perception of external objects. A thought is a sign requiring interpretation by a subsequent thought in order to achieve meaning. Therefore, perception which, unlike sensation, has form or meaning must involve inference. To the degree that perception does not appear to be inference, it must be unconscious inference. Because Peirce associated the view that thinking could be nothing other than what it appeared to be with Descartes' belief in the mind's immediate knowledge of its thoughts, Peirce called James a Cartesian. Source: The Nation 53, July 2 and 9, 1891 15 and 32-33. Upon this vast work no definitive judgment can be passed for a long time, yet it is probably safe to say that it is the most important contribution that has been made to the subject for many years. Certainly it is one of the most weighty productions of American thought. The directness and sharpness with which we shall state some objections to it must be understood as a tribute of respect. Beginning with the most external and insignificant characters, we cannot much admire it as a piece of bookmaking, for it misses the unity of an essay, and almost that of a connected series of essays, while not attaining the completeness of a thorough treatise. It is a large assortment of somewhat heterogeneous articles loosely tied up in one bag, with tendencies towards sprawling. With an extraordinarily racy and forcible style, Professor James is continually wresting words and phrases of exact import to unauthorized and unsuitable uses. He indulges himself with idiosyncrasies of diction and tricks of language such as usually spring up in households of great talent. To illustrate what we mean, we will open one of the volumes at random, and we come upon this, a statement ad hominem meant as part of a reduction to the absurd. Now a reductio ad absurdum is a species of demonstration, and as such can contain no argumentum ad hominem, which is merely something a man is obliged by his personal interests to admit. On the next page, we read, this dynamic, we had almost written dynamitic, way of representing knowledge. On the next page, they talk as if, with this miraculous tying or relating, the ego's duties were done. It is the same with the technical terms of psychology. Speaking of certain theories, our author says they carry us back to times when the soul as vehicle of consciousness was not discriminated, as it now is, from the vital principle presiding over the formation of the body. How can anybody write so who knows the technical meaning of vehicle? On the same page occurs this phrase, if unextended, it is absurd to speak of its having space relations at all, which sounds like a general attack on the geometry of points. Professor James's thought is highly original, or at least novel, but it is originality of the destructive kind. To prove that we do not know what it has been generally supposed that we did know, that given premises do not justify the conclusions which all other thinkers hold they do justify, is his peculiar function. For this reason the book should have been preceded by an introduction discussing the strange positions in logic upon which all its arguments turn. Even when new theories are proposed, they are based on similar negative or skeptical considerations, and the one thing upon which Professor James seems to pin his faith is the general incomprehensibility of things. He clings as passionately to that as the old lady of the anecdote did to her total depravity. Of course, he is materialistic to the core, that is to say, in a methodical sense, but not religiously, since he does not deny a separable soul nor a future life, for materialism is that form of philosophy which may safely be relied upon to leave the universe as incomprehensible as it finds it. It is possible that Professor James would protest against this characterization of his cast of mind. Brought up under the guidance of an eloquent apostle of a form of Swedenborgianism, which is materialism driven deep and clinched on the inside, and educated to the materialistic profession, it can only be by great natural breadth of mind that he can know what materialism is, by having experienced some thoughts that are not materialistic. He inclines towards Cartesian dualism, which is of the true strain of the incomprehensibles and modern materialism's own mother. There is no form of idealism with which he will condescend to argue. Even evolutionism, which has idealistic affinities, seems to be held for suspect. It is his métier to subject to severe investigation any doctrine whatever which smells of intelligibility. The keynote of this is struck in the preface, in these words, I have kept close to the point of view of natural science throughout the book. Every natural science assumes certain data uncritically, and declines to challenge the elements between which its own laws obtain, and from which its deductions are carried on. Psychology, the science of finite individual minds, assumes as its data, 1. Thoughts and feelings, and 2. A physical world in time and space with which they coexist and which, 3. They know. Of course these data themselves are discussable, but the discussion of them, as of other elements, is called metaphysics, and falls outside the province of this book. This book, assuming that thoughts and feelings exist, and are the vehicles of knowledge, thereupon contends that psychology, when she has ascertained the empirical correlation of the various sorts of thought and feeling with definite conditions of the brain, can go no farther, that is, as a natural science. If she goes farther, she becomes metaphysical. All attempts to explain our phenomenally given thoughts as products of deeper lying entities, whether the latter be named soul, transcendental ego, ideas, or elementary units of consciousness, are metaphysical. This book consequently rejects both the associationist and the spiritualist theories, and in this strictly positivistic point of view consists the only feature of it for which I feel tempted to claim originality. This is certainly well put considered as prestigiation. But when we remember that a natural science is not a person, and consequently does not decline to do anything, the argument evaporates. It is only the students of the science who can decline, and they are not banded together to repress any species of inquiry. Each investigator does what in him lies, and declines to do 1,000 things most pertinent to the subject. To call a branch of an inquiry metaphysical is merely a mode of objurgation, which signifies nothing but the author's personal distaste for that part of his subject. It does not in the least prove that considerations of that sort can throw no light on the questions he has to consider. Indeed, we suspect it might be difficult to show in any way that any two branches of knowledge should be allowed to throw no light on one another. Far less can calling one question scientific and another metaphysical warrant Professor James in consequently rejecting certain conclusions, against which he has nothing better to object. Nor is it in the least true that physicists confine themselves to such a strictly positivistic point of view. Students of heat are not deterred by the impossibility of directly observing molecules from considering and accepting the kinetical theory. Students of light do not brand speculations on the luminiferous ether as metaphysical, and the substantiality of matter itself is called in question in the vortex theory, which is nevertheless considered as perfectly germane to physics. All these are attempts to explain phenomenally given elements as products of deeper lying entities. In fact, this phrase describes, as well as loose language can, the general character of scientific hypotheses. Remark, 2, that it is not merely nor chiefly the soul and the transcendental ego, for which incomprehensibles he has some tenderness, that Professor James proposes to banish from psychology, but especially ideas which their adherents maintain are direct data of consciousness. In short, not only does he propose, by the simple expedient of declaring certain inquiries extra-psychological, to reverse the conclusions of the science upon many important points, but also by the same negative means to decide upon the character of its data. Indeed, when we come to examine the book, we find it is precisely this which is the main use the author makes of his new principle. The notion that the natural sciences accept their data uncritically we hold to be a serious mistake. It is true, scientific men do not subject their observations to the kind of criticism practiced by the high-flying philosophers, because they do not believe that method of criticism sound. If they really believed in idealism, they would bring it to bear upon physics as much as possible. But in fact they find it a wordy doctrine, not susceptible of any scientific applications. When, however, a physicist has to investigate, say, such a subject as the scintillation of the stars, the first thing he does is to subject the phenomena to rigid criticism to find whether these phenomena are objective or subjective, whether they are in the light itself, or arise in the eye, or in original principles of mental action, or in idiosyncrasies of the imagination, etc. The principle of the uncritical acceptance of data, to which Professor James clings, practically amounts to a claim to a new kind of liberty of thought, which would make a complete rupture with accepted methods of psychology and of science in general. The truth of this is seen in the chief application that has been made of the new method, in the author's theory of space perception. And into the enterprise of thus revolutionizing scientific method he enters with a light heart, without any exhaustive scrutiny of his new logic in its generality, relying only on the resources of the moment. He distinctly discourages a separate study of the method. No rules can be laid down in advance. Comparative observations, to be definite, must usually be made to test some pre-existing hypothesis, and the only thing then is to use as much sagacity as you possess, and to be as candid as you can. We have no space for any analysis of the contents of this work, nor is that necessary, for everybody interested in the subject must and will read the book. It discusses most of the topics of psychology in an extremely unequal way, but always interesting and always entertaining. We will endeavor to give a fair specimen of the author's critical method, for the work is essentially a criticism and exposition of critical principles, with a running commentary, to aid a judgment. For this purpose we will select a short section entitled Is Perception Unconscious Inference? Perception in its most characteristic features is, of course, a matter of association in a wide sense of that term. If two spots of light are thrown upon the wall of a dark room so as to be adjacent, and one of these is made red while the other remains white, the white one will appear greenish by contrast. If they are viewed through a narrow tube, and this is moved so that the red spot goes out of view, still the white one will continue to look green. But if the red light, now unseen, be extinguished and we then remove the tube from the eye, so as to take a new look, as it were, the apparent greenness will suddenly vanish. This is an example of 1,000 phenomena which have led several German psychologists to declare that the process of perception is one of reasoning in a generalized sense of that term. It is possible some of the earlier writers held it to be reasoning, strictly speaking. But most have called it unconscious inference, and unconscious inference differs essentially from inference in the narrow sense, all our control over which depends upon this, that it involves a conscious, though it may be an indistinct, reference to a genus of arguments. These German writers must also not be understood as meaning that the perceptive process is any more inferential than are the rest of the processes which the English have so long explained by association, a theory which until quite recently played little part in German psychology. The German writers alluded to explain an ordinary suggestion productive of belief, or any cognition tantamount to belief, as inference conscious or unconscious, as a matter of course. As German writers are generally weak in their formal logic, they would be apt to formulate the inference wrongly, but the correct formulation is as follows: a well-recognized kind of object, M, has for its ordinary predicates P1, P2, P3 etc., indistinctly recognized. The suggesting object, S, has these same predicates, P1, P2, P3, etc. Hence, S is of the kind M. This is hypothetic inference in form. The first premise is not actually thought, though it is in the mind habitually. This, of itself, would not make the inference unconscious. But it is so because it is not recognized as an inference, the conclusion is accepted without our knowing how. In perception, the conclusion has the peculiarity of not being abstractly thought, but actually seen, so that it is not exactly a judgment, though it is tantamount to one. The advantage of this method of explaining the process is conceived to be this: to explain any process not understood is simply to show that it is a special case of a wider description of process which is more intelligible. Now nothing is so intelligible as the reasoning process. This is shown by the fact that all explanation assimilates the process to be explained to reasoning. Hence, the logical method of explaining the process of association is looked upon as the most perfect explanation possible. It certainly does not exclude the materialistic English explanation by a property of the nerves. The monist school, to which the modern psychologists mostly belong, conceives the intellectual process of inference and the process of mechanical causation to be only the inside and outside views of the same process. But the idealistic tendency, which tinctures almost all German thought not very recent, would be to regard the logical explanation as the more perfect, under the assumption that the materialistic explanation requires itself ultimately to be explained in terms of the reasoning process. But Professor James is naturally averse to the logical explanation. Let us see, then, how he argues the point. His first remark is as follows: if every time a present sign suggests an absent reality to our mind, we make an inference, and if every time we make an inference, we reason, then perception is indubitably reasoning. Of course, every psychological suggestion is regarded as of the general nature of inference, but only in a far more general sense than that in which perception is so called. This should be well known to Professor James, and he would have dealt more satisfactorily with his readers if he had not kept it back. Namely, perception attains a virtual judgment, it subsumes something under a class, and not only so, but virtually attaches to the proposition the seal of assent to strong resemblances to inference which are wanting in ordinary suggestions. However, Professor James admits that the process is inference in a broad sense. What, then, has he to object to the theory under consideration? Only one sees no room in it for any unconscious part. Both associates, the present sign and the contiguous things which it suggests, are above board, and no intermediary ideas are required. Here are two errors. In the first place, unconscious inference does not, either with other logicians or with the advocates of the theory in question, mean an inference in which any proposition or term of the argument is unconscious, any more than conscious inference implies that both premises are conscious. But unconscious inference means inference in which the reasoner is not conscious of making an inference. He may be conscious of the premise, but he is not conscious that his acceptance of the conclusion is inferential. He does not make that side thought which enters into all inference strictly so called, and so it would be in every analogous case, or in most cases. There is no doubt, therefore, that ordinary suggestion, regarded as inference, is of the unconscious variety. But Professor James further forgets his logic in hinting, what he soon expresses more clearly, that such an inference is to be regarded as a mere immediate inference, because it has no middle term. We might suppose he had never heard of the modus ponens, the form of which, A and B being any proposition, is if A, then B, but A, hence, B. Those who think a light is thrown upon the ordinary process of suggestion by assimilating it to reasoning, assimilate it to the modus ponens. The proposition if A, then B, is represented by the association itself, which is not present to consciousness, but exists in the mind in the form of a habit, as all beliefs and general propositions do. The second premise A is the suggesting idea, the conclusion B is the suggested idea. Already quite off the track, our author now plunges into the jungle in this fashion. Most of those who have upheld the thesis in question have, however, made a more complex supposition. What they have meant is that perception is immediate inference, and that the middle term is unconscious. When the sensation which I have called this is felt, they think that some process like the following runs through the mind: this is M, but M is A, therefore this is A. Those who have upheld the thesis are not in dispute among themselves, as represented. They make no supposition throughout not admitted by all the world. To represent any process of inference now as a modus ponens, now as a syllogism with a middle term, is not necessarily taking antagonistic views. As for the syllogism given, it is the weakest mode of supporting the thesis, far more open to attack than the form first given above. But Professor James makes no headway, even against this. He says, now there seems no good grounds for supposing this additional will work in the mind. The classification of this as M is itself an act of perception, and should, if all perception were inference, require a still earlier syllogism for its performance, and so backwards ad infinitum. Not one of the authors whom we have consulted makes the M entirely unconscious, but Professor James says they do. If so, when he insists that this is M is an act of perception, he must mean some ultra-Leibnizian unconscious perception. Has he ever found the German authors maintaining that that kind of perception is inferential? If not, where is his regressus ad infinitum? What those authors do say is that M, and with it the two premises, are thrown into the background and shade of consciousness, that this is M is a perception, sometimes in the strict sense, sometimes only in that sense in which perception embraces every sensation. They do not hold sensation to be inferential, and consequently do not suppose a regressus ad infinitum. But even if they did, there would be no reductio ad absurdum, since it is well known to mathematicians that any finite interval contains an infinite number of finite intervals, so that supposing there is no finite limit to the shortness of time required for an intellectual process, an infinite number of them, each occupying a finite time, may be crowded into any time, however short. The professor concludes, so far, then, from perception being a species of reasoning, properly so called, both it and reasoning are coordinate varieties of that deeper sort of process known psychologically as the association of ideas, and we break the sentence, which goes on to something else, in order to remark that a species of reasoning properly so called must be a slip of the pen. For otherwise there would be an ignoratio elenchi, nobody ever having claimed that perception is inference in the strict sense of conscious inference. Instead of a species of reasoning properly so called, we must read reasoning in a generalized sense. Remembering also that Professor James began by insisting on extending the controversy to association in general, we may put association in place of perception, and thus the conclusion will be, so far from association being reasoning in a generalized sense, reasoning is a special kind of association. Who does not see that to say that perception and reasoning are coordinate varieties of association, is to say something in entire harmony with the thesis which Professor James is endeavoring to combat? To resume, physiologically as the law of habit in the brain. To call perception unconscious reasoning is thus either a useless metaphor or a positively misleading confusion between two different things. Here the section ends, and in these last words, for the first time in the whole discussion, the real question at issue is at length touched, and it is dismissed with an ipse dixit. There is no room for doubt that perception and, more generally, associative suggestion, may truthfully be considered as inference in a generalized sense. The only question is whether there is any use in so considering them. Had Professor James succeeded in establishing his regressus ad infinitum, he would have refuted himself effectually, since it would then have been shown that an important consequence, not otherwise known, had been drawn from the theory. As it is, he says nothing pertinent either pro or con. But a little before, when an unconscious predication was called perception, was this perception properly so called? And if not, was calling it by that name a useless metaphor, or was it a positively misleading confusion between two different things?